The evening was getting darker as the old subway train rattled through the underground tunnels of the city. The fluorescent lights inside the train car flickered on and off, making strange shadows dance across the worn-out seats. It was that odd time between rush hours when the subway cars were mostly empty, with just a handful of tired passengers heading home. Mrs. Chen had just finished her weekly grocery shopping at the Asian market where she'd been going for the past 30 years. She was carrying 2 heavy shopping bags filled with fresh vegetables, rice, and her favorite jasmine tea. Her leather purse, a gift from her late husband on their 40th wedding anniversary, hung securely on her shoulder. At 76, simple tasks like grocery shopping had become quite challenging. Her joints ached more these days, especially when the weather was damp like today. As she stepped into the subway car, she noticed how quiet it was. There were only 5 other people spread out across the car. A young man in a crisp military uniform sitting near the middle. A teenager with headphones bobbing his head to music. A tired-looking nurse still in her scrubs, and a couple deeply engaged in conversation at the far end. Mrs. Chen chose a seat near the door, carefully placing her grocery bags between her feet. The arthritis in her hands was particularly bothersome today, making it difficult to keep a firm grip on her bags. She had to stop several times during her shopping trip to rest her fingers, which had become stiff and swollen. Her doctor had suggested she get one of those wheeled shopping carts, but Mrs. Chen was stubborn. She'd been carrying her own groceries for over 50 years and wasn't about to change now. What Mrs. Chen didn't notice was the 6th passenger who had slipped into the car just before the doors closed. He stood near the opposite door, wearing a dark hoodie despite the warm weather. His eyes kept darting between Mrs. Chen's purse and the other passengers, particularly focusing on the young man in uniform who seemed to be dozing off. The train swayed as it moved through the tunnels, and Mrs. Chen held onto her seat with one hand while trying to keep her grocery bags from tipping over with the other. The movement caused one of her oranges to roll out of a bag, but before it could get far, a kind hand reached down to catch it. The nurse had noticed Mrs. Chen's struggle and moved closer to help. "Let me give you a hand with those bags," she offered with a warm smile, her own exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Mrs. Chen smiled back gratefully, reminded of her own daughter who worked as a doctor in another city. As they chatted quietly about the rising price of vegetables, neither of them noticed the hooded figure slowly making his way closer, using the train's movement as cover. The young man in uniform wasn't actually sleeping, though. Through barely opened eyes, he watched every move in the car, a habit he developed during his military training. Something about the hooded figure's behavior had caught his attention the moment they'd entered the car. The way the person moved, the constant scanning of surroundings, the slow but deliberate positioning. It all set off warning bells in his mind. The train entered a particularly dark section of tunnel, where the aging light system had been acting up for weeks. The maintenance crew was scheduled to fix it next week, but for now, it created patches of darkness that lasted several seconds longer than they should. As the car plunged into one of these darker stretches, tension filled the air like static electricity before a storm. The young serviceman had spent 5 years in the Marines, and something about this situation felt off. He'd learned to trust his instincts. They kept him and his buddies safe more times than he could count. From his seat, he could see everything happening in the subway car, though he kept his head tilted down as if he were lost in thought. Through his half-closed eyes, he noticed how the hooded figure moved with purpose, not the casual sway of a regular passenger. The way this person kept adjusting their position, always keeping track of where everyone was sitting. It was the behavior of someone planning something. The serviceman's hand unconsciously tightened on his duffel bag as he watched the scene unfold. Mrs. Chen was still chatting with the kind nurse about her grandchildren. "My youngest grandson just started walking last month," she said proudly, pulling out her phone to show some pictures. Her arthritis made it tricky to hold the phone steady, but the nurse leaned in with genuine interest, commenting on how adorable the baby looked. The train continued its journey through the dark tunnel. the wheels making that familiar clickety-clack sound against the rails. The teenager with headphones had dozed off, his head gently bobbing with the train's movement. The couple at the end of the car were now quietly looking at something on their phone together, occasionally pointing and whispering. Mrs. Chen's grocery bags rustled as she tried to reorganize them, making sure her eggs hadn't been crushed during the ride. The nurse had to head back to her seat to gather her things. Her stop was coming up next. As she moved away, the hooded figure saw their opportunity and shifted closer to Mrs. Chen, pretending to look at a subway map on the wall. The serviceman noticed how the stranger's body language changed. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people wouldn't pick up on. But he recognized the tension in the person's shoulders, the way they kept flexing their fingers. These were the signs of someone getting ready to act. He'd seen similar behavior during his training in spotting potential threats. The subway car's lights flickered again as they passed through a particularly rough section of track. Mrs. Chen reached into her purse to check if she had remembered to pack her blood pressure medicine. The hooded figure was now just a few feet away, still pretending to study the map, but clearly watching Mrs. Chen's movements in the reflection of the subway window. The train announcement crackled over the speakers, the voice distorted and barely understandable as it listed the next few stops. Most passengers ignored it, used the garbled sound system, but the hooded figure used the noise as cover to move even closer to Mrs. Chen. They were now standing right behind her seat, one hand partially hidden in their hoodie pocket. The serviceman slowly uncrossed his legs and shifted his weight forward, ready to move at a moment's notice. His training had taught him to be prepared while hoping he wouldn't need to act. He watched as the hooded figure's hidden hand emerged slightly from the pocket, and he caught a glimpse of something that made his jaw tighten. The person was wearing fingerless gloves, despite the warm weather. The subway car entered another dark stretch of tunnel, and the fluorescent lights dimmed significantly. Mrs. Chen was still focused on organizing her belongings, completely unaware of the danger lurking behind her. The nurse had just reached her stop and was stepping off the train, leaving one fewer witness to what was about to unfold. The teenager's music was still playing loudly through his headphones, and the couple remained absorbed in their phone, creating a false sense of normalcy that was about to be shattered. The hooded figure had been watching and waiting for the perfect moment. Like a predator studying its prey, they had observed how Mrs. Chen struggled with her bags, how her hands shook slightly when she reached for things, and how she seemed completely unaware of her surroundings. The timing had to be just right, when the train was between stations, when the lights were at their dimmest, when there would be the least chance of someone stopping them. The train rocked back and forth as it sped through the tunnel. The movement caused Mrs. Chen's grocery bags to tip slightly, and some apples rolled out onto the floor. As she bent down to reach for them, muttering quietly in a mix of English and Chinese, the hooded figure saw their chance. They moved even closer, using the train's motion as cover, their shoes making no sound on the worn subway floor. The serviceman watched all of this unfold, his muscles tense, but his breathing steady. Years of training had taught him how to remain calm in tense situations. He noticed how the hooded figure's right hand kept twitching inside their pocket, how their head moved in quick, sharp movements, checking if anyone was watching. The serviceman's hand quietly moved to unbuckle his duffel bag, preparing for what he knew was coming. Mrs. Chen finally managed to grab the last rolling apple, placing it carefully back in her bag. She smiled to herself, thinking about how her grandchildren loved the apple pies she made. She'd learned the recipe from an American cooking show years ago, and now it was a family favorite. As she sat back up, she felt a sudden presence behind her, but before she could turn around, everything happened at once. The hooded figure lunged forward, just as the train entered one of the darkest sections of the tunnel. Their gloved hand shot out, grabbing for Mrs. Chen's purse with unexpected force. The sudden movement caught Mrs. Chen off guard, causing her to lose her balance. Her grocery bags toppled over, sending fruits and vegetables rolling across the subway car floor. The sound of eggs cracking mixed with her startled cry. The teenager with headphones finally looked up, his eyes widening as he realized what was happening. The couple at the end of the car stopped their conversation mid-sentence, frozen in shock. But before anyone else could react, the serviceman was already moving. His training kicked in automatically, like muscle memory from countless drills and real-life situations. In the dim light, Mrs. Chen's voice trembled as she tried to hold onto her purse. "Please no," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The purse contained not just her money and cards, but also the last photo she had of her late husband, tucked safely in a worn leather wallet. She couldn't lose that. It was worth more to her than anything else she carried. The hooded figure pulled harder, trying to wrench the purse away. "Let go, old lady," they growled, their voice muffled by the train's noise. Their free hand came up, ready to strike, the dim light reflecting off their fingerless gloves. The other passengers watched in horror, their bodies frozen in that moment of shock that comes before action. But the servicemen had already closed the distance between them, moving with the silent efficiency that came from years of training. He could see the fear in Mrs. Chen's eyes, could hear her ragged breathing, and something inside him hardened. He'd sworn an oath to protect people, and that oath didn't end when he left the base. As the hooded figure raised their hand, the servicemen prepared to intervene, knowing the next few seconds would determine whether this would end in tragedy or justice. The next few seconds seemed to move in slow motion. Mrs. Chen's groceries were scattered across the subway car floor, tomatoes rolling in one direction, oranges in another. The smell of broken eggs filled the air as the hooded figure yanked harder at her purse. But Mrs. Chen wouldn't let go. That purse held her memories, her husband's photo, her life. Her small hands gripped the worn leather strap with surprising strength. The serviceman moved like flowing water. In one smooth motion, he crossed the space between them, his boots silent against the subway floor. His training had taught him that the element of surprise was often the best advantage. The hooded figure never saw him coming. They were too focused on trying to overpower the elderly woman. "Let go." The thief snarled again, raising their hand higher. The other passengers gasped. The teenager had pulled off his headphones, his music still playing faintly in the background. The couple at the end of the car had finally snapped out of their shock. The woman was already reaching for her phone to call for help. That's when the serviceman made his move. His right hand caught the thief's raised wrist in midair, while his left arm wrapped around Mrs. Chen's shoulders, steadying her before she could fall. The thief's eyes widened in surprise behind their hood, not expecting this sudden intervention. They tried to pull away, but the serviceman's grip was like iron. Firm enough to control, but careful not to cause injury. "I believe the lady said no," the serviceman said quietly, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of authority. He could feel Mrs. Chen trembling against his arm, but she was still standing strong, still holding onto her purse. The thief tried to twist away, but years of combat training had taught the serviceman exactly how to control someone without hurting them. The subway car rattled through the tunnel, its lights still flickering. The teenager had stood up now, moving to help gather Mrs. Chen's scattered groceries. The couple had managed to reach the emergency call button, pressing it to alert the subway staff. The woman from the couple called out, "The next station is only 2 minutes away. Help is coming." Mrs. Chen's breathing was quick but steadying. Despite her fear, she found her voice. "My husband's picture," she said, clutching her purse closer. "I can't lose his picture." The serviceman nodded understanding, maintaining his hold on the thief, who had now stopped struggling, seemed to realize they were caught. The thief's hood had fallen back slightly, revealing a young face marked not by cruelty, but by desperation. The serviceman recognized that look. He'd seen it before in war zones, in the eyes of people driven to bad choices by difficult circumstances. But recognition didn't mean acceptance. There were always better choices than hurting others. The teenager had managed to rescue most of Mrs. Chen's groceries, though the eggs were a lost cause. He'd found a spare plastic bag in his backpack and was carefully gathering the salvageable items. The couple moved closer, offering words of comfort to Mrs. Chen, creating a protective circle around her. Through it all, the serviceman maintained his calm control of the situation. His training had prepared him for much worse situations than this, but it had also taught him the importance of compassion along with control. The thief had stopped struggling now, perhaps realizing that their attempted crime had failed not just physically, but morally. The subway car continued its journey through the dark tunnel, but inside, the atmosphere had changed. What had started as an act of violence was being transformed by small acts of kindness and courage. The subway train's brakes squealed as it approached the next station. The fluorescent lights had steadied now, revealing a scene that looked very different from just minutes ago. The serviceman still maintained his professional hold on the would-be thief, but his other arm had guided Mrs. Chen to sit down safely. Her hands were shaking less now as she held her purse close to her chest. The teenager had finished gathering what he could of Mrs. Chen's groceries. "I think I saved most of it," he said, placing the makeshift bag carefully beside her. "Except for the eggs, and maybe the tomatoes are a bit bruised." Mrs. Chen looked up at him with grateful eyes, touched by this young stranger's kindness. The boy reminded her of her grandson, always trying to help, even when things got messy. The couple who had called for help stood nearby, the woman typing something on her phone. "I got it all on video," she said quietly to her partner. "From the moment that person grabbed her purse. The police will need this." Her hands were trembling slightly as she pressed send, sharing the video with the authorities who were waiting at the station. Through all of this, the thief had grown quieter, their initial aggression replaced by what looked like shame. The servicemen could feel the tension leaving their body, replaced by resignation. He'd seen this transformation before, the moment when someone realized the full weight of their actions. Sometimes, he thought, the best lessons come from our worst mistakes. The train began to slow down, its wheels screeching against the rails. Through the windows, they could see the station platform coming into view. Several transit police officers were already waiting, their uniforms bright under the station lights. Someone must have radioed ahead about what had happened. Mrs. Chen opened her purse with trembling fingers and pulled out an old leather wallet. With great care, she removed the photograph, holding it close to her heart for a moment before looking at it. It showed a kind-faced man in his Sunday best, smiling at the camera. "My husband," she explained to no one in particular, her voice soft but steady. 45 years together. This is the last photo we took before." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The thief, hearing this, seemed to shrink even smaller. The serviceman noticed a tear rolling down their cheek. Perhaps they were thinking about their own family, their own choices, the path that had led them to this moment. The subway car finally came to a complete stop, and the doors opened with their familiar hiss. The transit police moved efficiently but calmly, taking control of the situation. As they led the thief away, one officer stopped to check on Mrs. Chen. "Are you all right, ma'am? Do you need medical attention?" he asked kindly. Mrs. Chen shook her head, managing a small smile. No, I am fine. Thanks to..." She looked up at the serviceman, realizing she didn't even know his name. The teenager stepped forward, still holding the bag of rescued groceries. "I can help carry these if you need," he offered, his earlier headphones now hanging forgotten around his neck. The couple joined in. "We can wait with you while you give your statement to the police." The woman added, "And maybe we should all make sure you get home safely after this." The serviceman watched as this impromptu community formed around Mrs. Chen. In his years of service, he'd learned that often the worst situations brought out the best in people. The bright station lights now illuminated not just one hero, but many, each person who had chosen to help rather than look away, to stand up rather than stand back. The station buzzed with activity as 2 more police officers arrived to take statements. Everyone gathered around a wooden bench where Mrs. Chen now sat, her rescued groceries placed carefully beside her. The fluorescent station lights cast a harsh glow, but somehow the scene felt warm with human kindness. "Can you tell us what happened?" one of the officers asked gently, notebook in hand. Mrs. Chen looked around at the faces of those who had helped her, the servicemen standing tall but humble, the teenagers still hovering protectively near her groceries, and the couple who had captured everything on video. Their presence gave her strength. "I was just coming home from shopping," she began, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "I go every Wednesday, same time, same train. My husband used to say I was as regular as a clock." She smiled at the memory. The officer nodded encouragingly, taking notes while his partner reviewed the couple's video footage. The serviceman stepped forward to give his account. "I noticed suspicious behavior the moment they entered the car," he explained professionally. "The way they moved, how they chose their position, it showed planning." The officers listened intently, recognizing the trained observations of a fellow professional. Meanwhile, the teenager had been rummaging in his backpack. He pulled out a slightly squashed but whole apple, one that had rolled his way during the chaos. "Here," he said, offering it to Mrs. Chen. "At least we saved this one." The simple gesture brought tears to her eyes, reminding her of how her own grandson would always try to make things better in his own small ways. The couple who had recorded everything were showing the video to the second officer. "Look here," the woman pointed out. "You can see how they waited for the dark section of the tunnel." Her hand trembled slightly as she held the phone, still processing the events she had witnessed. Her partner kept a supportive arm around her shoulders. One of the station staff arrived with a cup of hot tea for Mrs. Chen. "Sugar and honey," she said kindly. "Good for shock." The small act of kindness made Mrs. Chen's eyes water again. She took a sip, letting the warm liquid calm her nerves. The serviceman noticed how her hands had finally stopped shaking. "We've had reports of similar incidents on this line," the first officer explained, closing his notebook. "But thanks to everyone here, especially you, sir," he nodded to the serviceman, "we might have caught the person responsible for all of them." The teenager's eyes widened at this news, realizing they had all been part of stopping something bigger than just one attempted theft. Mrs. Chen reached into her purse and carefully took out the photo of her husband again. "He always said to look for the helpers," she said softly, looking at his smiling face. "He said that when bad things happen, look for the people who come to help." She glanced around at the group gathered near her bench. He was right. The station manager approached, offering to call a taxi for Mrs. Chen, but the couple quickly spoke up. "We live in the same direction," the woman said. "We'd be happy to share a cab and make sure you get home safely." The teenager added, "And I can carry your groceries to the car." Their genuine concern for her well-being brought a fresh wave of warmth to Mrs. Chen's heart. The servicemen watched all this unfold, standing slightly apart now that the immediate danger had passed. In his years of service, he'd learned that sometimes the real victory wasn't in the moment of action, but in what happened after, in how people came together, how strangers became protectors, how a terrible moment could transform into something that restored faith in humanity. Outside the subway station, the city lights were beginning to twinkle as evening settled in. A gentle breeze carried the scent of rain, and the streets were quieter now that rush hour had passed. The taxi the station manager had called was waiting, its yellow paint gleaming under the streetlights. The teenager carefully loaded Mrs. Chen's salvaged groceries into the taxi's trunk, making sure nothing would spill. "My mom's about your age," he said quietly. "I keep thinking about how I'd want someone to help her if something like this happened." Mrs. Chen reached out and patted his hand, a gesture that spoke louder than words. The couple who had recorded the incident insisted on sharing the taxi ride. "We're just 3 blocks past your street," the woman explained, though truthfully, they lived in the opposite direction. Some things were more important than convenience. Her partner had already given their contact information to the police, promising to send any additional footage they might need. Before getting into the taxi, Mrs. Chen turned to the serviceman who had stayed nearby, making sure everything was settled. "Young man," she said, her voice full of emotion, "you remind me of my husband when he was your age. He was also a brave man who helped others." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small packet of almond cookies. "I always carry these. He loved them too." The serviceman accepted the cookies with a respectful nod, touched by the simple gesture. "Just doing what anyone would do, ma'am," he said softly, though they all knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have acted so quickly, so decisively, so carefully. The police officers had finished taking statements and were preparing to leave. One of them paused to share some news. "We've been looking for this suspect for weeks," he explained. "Your actions today might have prevented many more incidents." He handed Mrs. Chen a card with a case number and contact information, his manner professional but kind. The station manager, who had been watching everything unfold, stepped forward. "We're going to review our lighting systems," she announced, "especially in that dark stretch of tunnel. Sometimes it takes an incident like this to show us what needs fixing." She looked troubled that it had taken something so serious to highlight this safety issue. As Mrs. Chen settled into the taxi's backseat, she clutched her purse close, feeling the familiar shape of her wallet with her husband's photo. The teenager closed the trunk and waved goodbye. The couple climbed in next to her, creating a protective bubble of companionship for the ride home. The servicemen watched the taxi pull away, still holding the packet of cookies. A news van was pulling up to the station. Someone had called the media. But he quietly slipped away before they could arrive. He'd learned in the military that sometimes the best rewards were the smallest ones, like a grandmother's cookies and the knowledge that someone was safer because of your actions. Back in the station, the night shift workers were already spreading the story. "Did you hear what happened on car 6? They whispered to each other. About the elderly lady and the Marine. The story grew with each telling. Not in exaggeration, but in meaning. It became about more than just an attempted theft. It became about the connections that can form in moments of crisis, about the courage that lives in ordinary people, about the simple acts of kindness that can change everything." The next morning, the story was everywhere. Local news stations played the couple's video footage, though they carefully blurred Mrs. Chen's face for privacy. "Hero Marine stops subway thief," read the headlines, but they missed the deeper story that had unfolded in that subway car. In her small apartment, Mrs. Chen sat at her kitchen table, sipping jasmine tea from her favorite cup. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. First her daughter calling from the West Coast, then her son from overseas, both worried and relieved after seeing the news. "I'm fine," she assured them. People were so kind, so many good people. The bruised tomatoes from her spilled groceries sat in a bowl on her counter. She planned to make them into soup, remembering how her husband always said food tasted better when it told a story. These tomatoes had quite a tale to tell. As she chopped them, she thought about the teenager who had gathered them up, how his kindness had reminded her of hope. At the police station, the investigation was revealing more than expected. The would-be thief turned out to be connected to a string of similar incidents across the city. But this one was different, one detective noted during the morning briefing. "This one showed us how a community can come together." On his desk sat a printout of witness statements, the servicemen's precise observations, the couple's careful documentation, the teenager's helpful actions. The subway station was busier than usual that morning. People slowed down as they passed through, pointing at the spot where it had happened. The station manager had kept her word. Maintenance crews were already working on the lighting in the tunnel. "No more dark spots," she insisted, supervising the repairs. "Not on my watch." The couple who had shared the taxi ride had posted a small update on their neighborhood social media group. They didn't mention names or share the video, respecting privacy. Instead, they wrote about community, about looking out for each other, about how a subway car full of strangers had become something more. Their post was being shared across the city. In a quiet corner of a veterans center across town, the serviceman sat with his unopened packet of almond cookies. His fellow veterans had seen the news, but he brushed off their praise. The real story, he told them, was how everyone helped. The kid with the groceries, the couple with the video, the station manager with the tea. He finally opened the cookies, sharing them with the other veterans. They tasted like his grandmother's baking, like home, like kindness. The teenager had told his story at school that morning, but not to brag. "I keep thinking about my mom," he said to his friends during lunch. "About how we all need someone to look out for us sometimes." His headphones lay silent in his backpack. He was more interested in listening to the world around him now. Local community groups were already organizing. Safety in numbers became their motto as they planned volunteer programs to accompany elderly shoppers. The subway authority announced increased security measures, but more importantly, they spoke about building a culture of caring, where every passenger felt responsible for each other. Mrs. Chen placed her husband's photo back in its special place in her wallet. She remembered what he used to say about ripples in a pond, how one small action could spread out and touch many lives. This wasn't just a story about a stopped theft anymore. It had become something bigger, something about the threads that connect people, about the courage to help, about the choice to be kind when it matters most. 1 month later, the subway car looked different. The lights in the tunnel had all been fixed, casting a steady, bright glow through the windows. But the biggest change wasn't in the lighting, it was in the people. Passengers looked up from their phones more often now, noticing each other, sharing small smiles and nods of acknowledgement. Mrs. Chen still took the same train every Wednesday for her shopping. But now she was rarely alone. Sometimes the teenager would appear, his headphones around his neck instead of his ears, helping her carry her bags. Other times, the couple would spot her and share stories about their week. The station manager always had a warm greeting and a watchful eye. The serviceman had become a regular visitor at Mrs. Chen's community center, where he helped teach a free self-defense class for seniors. "It's not about fighting," he would explain gently. "It's about awareness, confidence, and knowing you're not alone." The almond cookies always made an appearance during break time, and the seniors loved hearing Mrs. Chen tell the story of that evening on the subway. The attempted theft had led to something unexpected. A neighborhood watch program that felt more like a community family. The couple had helped organize it, using their experience to show others how to look out for each other. Remember, they would say at meetings, it's not about being heroes. It's about being human. Local schools had invited the teenager to speak about what happened. He was shy at first, but he found his voice when talking about small acts of kindness. "You don't have to do something big to make a difference," he would tell other students. "Sometimes just picking up spilled groceries can change someone's whole day." Mrs. Chen's daughter had worried at first, wanting her mother to move closer to her on the West Coast. But Mrs. Chen stood firm. "Here, I have a whole community," she explained during their weekly video calls. "Your father would have loved to see this." She kept his photo in her wallet, but now it had company. A group picture from the community center, showing all the faces that had become part of her extended family. The subway authority had installed a small plaque at the station. It didn't mention the attempted theft. Instead, it read, "When we look out for each other, we all get home safely." Simple words, but they carried the weight of truth learned through experience. The would-be thief's story had taken an unexpected turn too. After facing consequences for their actions, they had chosen to participate in a restorative justice program. Mrs. Chen had agreed to meet them, bringing her almond cookies to share. "Sometimes," she told them, "we need to fall to learn how to stand up again." In the end, what happened on that subway car was more than just a stopped crime. It became a reminder that in a city of millions, we're never really alone. That courage wears many faces: the quick action of a trained serviceman, the kindness of a teenager, the quick thinking of a couple with a phone, the steady presence of those who step up when needed. As the early evening sun cast long shadows through the subway windows, Mrs. Chen sat in her usual spot, a fresh bag of groceries at her feet. She watched the mix of people around her: students with backpacks, office workers heading home, parents with young children. Each one carried their own story, but now they were all part of something bigger. Something that started with fear but ended with friendship. Something that proved her husband's words right. In the darkest moments, look for the helpers, but more importantly, be one.